Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're on to the aircraft portion of the leaks, and I'm going to do these in sets of 5. So unfortunately there won't be chapters, but understand, pretty much every vehicle here is interesting in one way or another. The first one is the Douglas A4M. Now we have some A4s already in the game. The most recent one added was the A4E, which was the squadron vehicle. The A4M is a marine version of the Skyhawk 2. It has improved avionics and also a better engine in the form of the J52 P408, has a slightly different cockpit, an IFF system, and also has a new bombing system, TV, and laser spot tracker. So this thing has all the bells and whistles to be that multi-role vehicle we all know and love in the form of the A4. When it comes to America as well, there is a bunch of other stuff, including the A7E. Once again, we already have a bunch of A7s in the game, or at least one. Now it's time for the A7E, which is a heavily modified version of the A7D, which we see. It has the same engine and the same gun in it, but what it improves is the navigational radar and also terrain following radar. Plus, it also has provisions to be a carrier-based aircraft for carrier operations, being a naval version. So probably will have the same types of armaments that the standard one has in the game. The next vehicle is the AH-56. Now this is the Cheyenne. This is a very interesting helicopter, which unfortunately lost out to the AH-64 series, or the Apache as you know it, for the idea that it was built for, which was the attack helicopter role. The AH-56 has a lot of really interesting designs and innovations built into it, including a single rigid 4-bladed main rotor and anti-torque tail rotor, and a 3-blade pusher as well on top of that. It could also carry a bunch of different armaments, with the fact it could carry 6 pylons, which could carry either tows or rocket pods in the form of FFARs. And for me, this helicopter is very wonky when you have a look at it, and could also has a nose turret and a bottom turret as well, which would house the XM51 turret or the XM52 in the belly, with stuff such as the 40mm grenade launcher or even the minigun, which we see on the AH-64, or even a 30mm, which could come to the party if this thing was further developed. As I said though, unfortunately it lost out to a bunch of other helicopters which were used in different roles and never really went anywhere after the 10 of them which were built. The next variant is the AH-6M, and this is known as a different name that you may know. It's the Little Bird. The Little Bird is an American helicopter. It's known as the MH-6M is the attack variant of the AH-6, used for special operations for the United States Army. It has a 5-bladed main rotor and is incredibly small and designed to be quick, agile, and aggressive at the same time. It can have access to 12.7s, 7.62s in the form of miniguns, or, if you really want to get out there, Hellfires and also Stinger missiles, so very similar to some of the high-ranking French helicopters that we have. Plus, it could also have some rocket pods instead of that, which would be nice to see as well. And then also the Martin Baltimore. Now, the Martin Baltimore was developed from the Martin Maryland, which is a vehicle which has been pottering around in the game for a while, or at least in the files, and the Baltimore is a US aircraft which was mainly used by the British. It was designed and was supposed to be sent to France, which it was, but then with the fall of France, the production series was diverted to Great Britain. Therefore, all of the Marylands which were in France or going to France went to the UK, and so did the Baltimores after it. This meant that it was used by the Royal Air Force, the Canadians, the Australians, Australians, and also the South Africans, which is really nice to see. And there's a ton of different variants of it, generally designed for different ideas when it comes to its weaponry and also when it comes to its engines. The standard one, which we'll probably get, is the piston-engined version with the Wright GR2600s. It had 8 fixed Browning machine guns with 2 flexible Vickers in it, and also a bunch of bombs that it could carry as well, up to 2,000 pounds, which were carried internally. The Bf-110C3 is also around once again, the C3 being based off the C variant of the Bf-110, which was the first major production variant of the aircraft, which had access to DB601 engines. The C3 is as a Storer version of the C, and it had upgraded 20mm MGFFs, and they upgraded them to MGFF-Ms, basically meaning that it would be a little bit more powerful than its predecessors. Then we have the SNCAO-200. This is a prototype French fighter, which unfortunately succumbed to the fate of a lot of other French prototypes at the beginning of World War II. France was invaded by Germany, lost the Battle of France, and then a lot of these prototypes kind of disappeared. The SNCAO-200 was a single built prototype. It would have had access to one 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS404 and 2 7.5mm machine guns as well. It was of all metal design, and one of the issues that it mainly had was it was supposed to have one specific Hispano-Suiza engine, but by the time it was fully built, the engine wasn't ready, so they had to downgrade it to another one, meaning that it lost around about 300 horsepower worth of engine power, so getting downgraded from an 1100 horsepower engine to an 861. There are supposed reports that the prototype was used in combat during the Battle of France, but obviously when it comes to these things, you got to be a bit skeptical. The next vehicle on the list is a surprise, but not too much of one. It's the Cessna 172. The Cessna 172, the Skyhawk, is one of the most produced planes in the history of the world. There's over 44,000 of them built, and with its first flight being in 1955, and it is still in production today. Now, obviously, with a vehicle like this, it is much more of a civilian aircraft than anything else, but what you've got to understand in War Thunder, we have a bunch of allied aircraft or AI aircraft running around the place, and pretty much just being there, part of maps or maybe stationary in areas with damage models, and this may be an example of that, or it may be one of the fighter variants or attacker, like ground attacker variants that have been used by several militias or also several countries over the years. Following this idea, there's also the Cessna 208, the Caravan, and this, about 3,000 of them have been built overall. This is a utility aircraft which is produced by Cessna, which is probably going to fill a similar role to the first Cessna, which we have in the list. Then we have a crowd favorite when it comes to American vehicles, the F-105 Thunder Chief. This one has been talked about many different times, being a supersonic fighter bomber for the United States Air Force. I've been asked a lot of the times, why isn't this in game already? And who knows? Maybe because they're saving it for something, maybe because it has a ridiculous bomb load, which they have to work out how to limit. When it comes to the F-105, it has access to one 20mm Welkin 6-barrel Gatling cannon, so the same as a lot of other machines we have at high tiers, but the main interest in it is what it can carry when it comes to its hardpoints. It has 5 of them, 4 in the wings, 1 centerline pylon, and then also an internal bomb bay that can carry 14,000 pounds worth of ordnance. It can carry rockets, it can carry sidewinders, it can carry bullpups, it can carry Shrikes. This thing can pretty much do it all when it comes to aviation, and also can go over Mach 1. Can also carry all the different types of bombs that we have in game, plus some others such as nuclear weapons and cluster munitions that it may use in the future in War Thunder. It was only used by the United States and is an absolutely beautiful aircraft which was produced at a decent number, and I definitely feel like when it does come to the game, it's going to make a big splash. We also have the F5E AIDC, which was actually on the leak list from before the last update. And the F5E AIDC is a vehicle which is built by the Aerospace Industrial Development Corporation, which is in Taiwan. This is a license-built version of the F5E from America. There's also a ton of H75 variants, which are also there. Including the H75A3. The A3 is a third production batch of the H75, which was designed for France. It's very similar to the A2 that I believe we already have in game. The A5 is there as well, which is very similar to the A4, but it was built under license in China, so this would be a Chinese A5. You've also got the A6, which was one which was designed for Norway, which was captured during the German invasion and were eventually sold to Finland, so that could end up in the Swedish tech tree. The A7, which was the version for the Netherlands East Indies, which had a different engine in the form of a 1200 horsepower Cyclone. It also had one 50 cal and one 7.7mm machine gun in the cal and two 7.7s in the wings, and later on there was four 7.7s which were used, and the ability to carry 6 50-pound bombs. There was also the H75N variant. This was a simplified version which was made for Thailand at the time, and this would have non-retractable landing gear and also wheel pants, so basically one where you couldn't elevate the gear on it. The H145 is also here, and that translates to the Eurocopter EC145. This is a utility helicopter, which is manufactured by Eurocopter and also Kawasaki Heavy Industries and Airbus helicopters. It's been around for a pretty long time, about 20 years, and there's over 1,500 of them which have been built. Kind of surprising to see this machine. There is actually a militarized version of it. It's known as the EC645T2, and what it is the M variant, the H145M. It has extra ballistic protection and also a pintle mounted 7.62mm machine guns or miniguns that it can have. This variant though, the H145, is just kind of the standard updated version of the aircraft from its initial release, so not entirely sure how that would fit in War Thunder. Then you also have the UH-1, the Huey. This is the model HKP3C though. I believe it's the Swedish Huey that we've talked about before, so my guess is that will come in at some point. Then the J5N1 Late. Now the J5N1 is an aircraft which I believe we already have in game, the twin-engine fighter for the Japanese, and it generally is actually pretty fun to play in game. The late variant would have been a Schrag Music variant, so it would have 420mm, which would be pointing up at an angle through the center of the fuselage, very similar to other machines that we have in the game, such as a variant of the Key 45, and this would mean that it would be useful in an anti-bomber role, but also be heavier compared to its standard one. Then you have the JA37, the Vegan, the Saab 37 Vegan, which is one of those vehicles I know a lot of people have been looking forward to for a long time when it comes to Sweden. Obviously with the Draken added, now with the Vegan at least known about, when it comes to War Thunder, maybe we'll see that thing pretty soon. It is a supersonic aircraft, a single-seat, single-engine machine designed for Sweden by Saab, and it was used in a variety of Rolls from the 1970s to the 1990s. It was only recently retired in 2007, where it had quite a long career as a general vehicle. It also has access to a ton of pretty interesting stuff, with the main armament being one 30mm Oerlikon, and then also it had 6 hardpoints or 6 missile stations on it, designed for sky flashes, AMRAMs and also sidewinders, which it could bring along, including an ECM pod as well. So not just an aircraft which would be Mach 2.1 capable, but also with a double delta wing design, which is really interesting, plus some pretty cool ordnance as well. On top of this, you have the MBIII. The MBIII is the precursor to the Martin Baker 5 that we already have in the game as a premium for the British. The main difference between them is the armament and the engine. The MBIII had access to 6 Hispano Mark II 20mm cannons. Unfortunately, the prototype crashed, meaning that they moved on to the MB5. But the other major difference between them is the MB3 uses the Napier Sabre H24 piston engine with 2,000 horsepower and a 3-bladed prop, where when it comes to the MB5, it uses obviously a slightly different set when it comes to its propeller, since it has contra-rotating propeller on it itself and less armament. The MB3 would be lovely to see in the game, definitely a cool British fighter design, but unfortunately never really went anywhere, but cool nonetheless. The MDR6 is also shown. This was actually leaked what feels like a few years ago now, and the general base model of it was leaked. And as you can see, it is quite a large vehicle, basically a 1930s Soviet Union reconnaissance flying boat aircraft. And the interesting thing about this is its armament, its defensive armament, is one 7.62mm Shikass machine gun in the bow turret and one 12.7mm in the dorsal turret, but its bomb load is 1,000 kilos for a 1930s vehicle. This does mean its maximum speed was only 360 kilometers an hour, being powered with the 2 Shvetsov M63 radial piston engines, but overall it's definitely an interesting vehicle and happy to see it make an appearance once again. The next one is the P-35, the Seversky machine for the US. It was the first single-seat fighter in the United States Army Air Corps. Which had all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and also an enclosed cockpit. It was introduced in 1937. And they made around about 196 of them. It was actually developed into a vehicle we already have in game as an event vehicle, the P-43 Lancer. So with the P-35, what you're getting is a pretty bog-standard little fighter. It will have access to the Pratt & Whitney R1830 45 Twin Wasp radial engine with around about 1,000 horsepower and 2 30 caliber machine guns with 2 50s, very similar to what we see from other American vehicles, and up to around about 350 pounds of bombs. It'll be pretty fun. It'll be probably on the same level as 2.0, something like that, just to have a bit of fun with. Then we have the P-47D-22 for the USSR. This would obviously be the variant for the USSR. The USSR already have a bunch of different variants which exist. This would just be on top of it. It would be a Razorback variant of the vehicle, and also I believe would be exactly the same as the British one, which we have the Thunderbolt Mark I, which is already in game. Then you have the PA-18. This is one of those head scratches once again. This is a 2-seat single-engine monoplane, but it was also built in 1949. They made 10,000 of the damn things, and this is it's a not amphibious vehicle, it's a float plane, sorry. It's one of those which I don't think was ever used in a military way. Maybe there was a few which were used in military ways, designed for very specific things, but it does have access to a pretty weak engine in the Lycoming 0320 with 150 horsepower. It could carry a crew of 1, and also wouldn't be able to exceed 246 kilometers an hour. Definitely not the fastest thing around, but a little bit of fun. Then we have a PBM, the PBM5A. There was actually a bunch of PBMs that used to be just sat in the files for a long time, and one of them was this variant, the 5A. And basically, when it comes to the 5A, what you're finding is a vehicle which is very similar to the PBM5, which has access to 2,100 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800s, and also may have access to a slightly better radar, but I also believe that may just be the 5E. The 5A might just be the amphibious variant of the PBM5 in itself, which would be very similar to the standard 5. Then there's something called the PBR test. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's a test for a specific thing, such as a specific bomb or something like that. It's quite hard to tell. Then we have the Q5D. The Q5D is an upgraded variant of the Q5. It's actually better than the Q53, which was one of the first Q5s to be able to use air-to-air missiles. The Q5D is just a big project, which would be kind of like the Q54 in different hands. It would have access to 2 Liming Wopen 6A afterburning turbojet engines. It would also have access to the 223mm that we all know and hate. Then 10 hardpoints with a capacity of 2,000 kilos. It could carry a bunch of different rockets. It could also carry the PL2s, PL5s, or PL7s when it comes to air-to-air missiles, and even stuff such as cluster bombs on the vehicle itself, and stuff such as fuel tanks. So an upgraded version of the Q5. I also believe it should have access to flares as well, since it does come after the 5.3, and the 5.3 also had an RWR installed, which I'm sure was there on the 5D as well. The Ambrosia Shackleton also makes a return. This is one of those vehicles that is in and out of the files quite a lot, and I don't really know why. The Ambrosia Shackleton is a long-range maritime patrol aircraft which was used by the RAF during the 50s, and it's definitely an interesting machine. It actually was used all the way up into the 90s for this role, and generally it is quite an interesting vehicle with a very specific purpose. There are 2 variants that we can see, which I believe are the Mark II and the Mark III. The Mark II is distinguished because of the additional 20mm in the nose that it has, which are coupled with the dorsal turret, which also has 220mm, where the Mark III has no 20mm in the nose, and instead has some increased fuel capacity, and also has some little bit better design for the crew inside, which there is quite a lot of. This thing has 10 crew members in it, and along with that, it is powered by the 4 RollsRoyce Griffin 57s, the piston engines with nearly 2,000 horsepower each, and the propellers are 6 bladed contra-rotating propellers which are around the place. This machine can go at around about 480 kilometers an hour max, and with the armaments also could carry 10,000 pounds worth of either bombs, torpedoes, mines, or even nuclear depth charges around the place. It has access to the ASV radar and also sonar buoys as well, and a bunch of other things. It's an interesting vehicle because it's so large, and also I'm not entirely sure how it would fit in the game, but maybe one day it'll come. Then we have the Spitfire Mk7. The Spitfire Mk7 was a high-altitude variant of the Spitfire. Therefore, it had a pressurized cabin. It also had an extended span for its wings, and initially a 2-speed, 2-stage intercooled Merlin engine. Because of the production run of the Spitfire Mk7, it actually, depending on which one you look at, it has different engines. So you have the Merlin Merlin-64s, the Merlin-70s, and also the Merlin-71, which was used all on the Spitfire Mk7. There was only 100, or just more than 100 built of this thing, and it did have some pretty interesting features, such as the extended wings and also the machine guns. It had still the 4.303 machine guns that we all know and love on the Spitfires, and two 20mm cannons as well in the wings. The vehicle itself was unfortunately kind of beaten by the Spitfire Mk9, which was at the time seen as an interim solution, but because of its performance took over the role of the Spitfire. And then you also have two Super Mystères. You have the B2 Tsar and the B2 Sambad. I believe these are in reference to the B2s which were exported by the French to the Israelis and also maybe to Honduras. They were used in both the air forces. Not a ton of them were used. The Israelis used 24 of them, and Honduras using around about 16. This shouldn't be too different from the standard Super Mystère, which we see in the French tech tree. The Swift F2 makes an appearance. This is a development of the Swift F1, which was the first production aircraft of the Supermarine Swift series. The difference between the two is the F2 has access to 430mm, where the F1 only had access to 2. And because it had access to 430mm, the F2, they had to move around some fuel tanks. So what they did is they increased the wing sweep on the wings, and this meant that extra fuel could be stored in them, so therefore it could carry the same amounts of fuel but also have access to more guns. The next one is the Welkin. Now the Welkin has been in and out of the files once again, very similar to other vehicles, and the Westland Welkin is a high altitude twin engine heavy fighter made by the British during World War II. The worry from the British point of view, especially the RAF, was that Germany would be able to carry out very high altitude bombing on London itself and or on just different areas of England. It was a worry that they would be able to even be in the stratosphere, so they needed a vehicle to be able to get up there to fight them, especially after in 1940 there was a bunch of JU-86Ps which were flying reconnaissance at such ridiculous heights. Now, luckily for the RAF and also England, the threat never actually came about. The Germans never had such high altitude bombers, and therefore the Welkin, even though 75 of them were produced, never really saw action in their actual combat role. So luckily, they didn't have to be used in that way. The main interesting thing about the Welkin is that it uses the RollsRoyce Merlin Mark 76-77 engines. These were a two-stage RollsRoyce Merlin engine with 1200 horsepower each, and also had access to 4 20mm Hispano cannons. Now in the files there is a Mark I and a Mark I late. Looking at the pictures, the major difference between them seems to be the engines, specifically maybe the exhaust, and I know they did make a night fighter version of the Welkin, but it was a two-seat version, so that would be much more obvious to see. So I think the Mark I late may be slightly different engines compared to the normal one, but I'm not entirely sure the difference. Then we have the Wessex. The Wessex is just a British-built Sikorsky H-34, which we already have in the game in at least 2 variants in the French tech tree, and also as a event vehicle in the American tech tree. So the H-34 becomes the Westland Wessex because it was built by Westland Helicopters in 1960s, or it was at least introduced in the 1960s, used until the early 2000s, and would obviously have access to all of the different weaponry that the other variants would have access to. Then we have the Whirlwind Mark II. The Whirlwind Mark II is just a single-seat twin-engine fighter-bomber version of the Whirlwind, known as the Whirly Bombers, which is pretty cool. There were 67 conversions made of the original Mark I fighter, and pretty much all they did was fit underwing bomb racks to it, giving it a bit more of a lease of life, even with its underpowered engines. We kind of have a variant in-game of the Whirlwind, the P, which is, or the P9 prototype, which is probably the closest to the Whirlwind 2, but still, it would be slightly different, especially if they went with the experimental stuff with access to a 37mm and a bunch of 303s in the form of 12 of them. Then the last vehicle is the YF2L1. This is a P-59 Aerocomet, which has been designed for naval use in the US. It was used for the US Naval, or it was used by the US Navy for carrier evaluations, just to see if they wanted to use it on the naval side of things instead of just the Air Force and Army side of things. So yeah, it would be very similar to the standard P-59. Might be a little bit different, but would definitely be pretty cool in that regard. That is all the vehicles that have been at least found. There is a few which I don't really understand, such as Trike and WTS. My guess is these are keywords or code words for testing specific ideas when it comes to certain aircraft. Anyway, I hope you all have enjoyed the videos. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank BRFC, Swollen Ostrich, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe A, Conte Baraka, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Lafouche, Barine, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.